This video was produced for entertainment. It is meant to show you the experiences I've had and to express some opinions that I have about how you should be making brass ingots from cartridge brass. The techniques that I'm going to show you here are not exclusive. There's other ways of doing it, and you should avail yourself of reading material, look at other tutorials, or perhaps get somebody who has actual safe experience to show you how to do it. Ultimately, you're responsible for what you choose to do. There is some danger in handling molten brass. I don't make any product endorsements here, but I'm going to show you some products. So let's get to it by explaining some of the equipment. I have on lightweight gloves for almost the whole process, but when I'm handling molten brass, I use heavy gloves. I have some cast iron molds. There are some big old channel locks that when you're handling the molds full of brass and you want to knock the brass out, these are very handy. There are, of course, tongs that you can use, but do not pick up the crucible by these tongs. You see the bite out of this one here? That's because it pulled a piece out and wrecked the crucible. Now, this crucible has about 50 melts in it, so it's got a bunch of crap inside of it. And this is what that would look like when it was new. Nice. This is, of course, the furnace. This one has two burners, a lid, and I'll show you in a while that there is an insulating brick in the bottom of the furnace. You need to either come up with an industrial strength spoon or take a piece of steel stock and make yourself a spoon. What's that for? Well, at times we're going to be pushing the brass down into the crucible, or near the end we're going to be scooping out dross and knocking it off to clean up the brass. Cartridge brass has a lot of impurities in it. I mean, the primers, there's sand, there's dirt, leftover combustion products, etc., and it's not particularly clean. This is a lifting tong for the crucible where it grips it on both sides and you can safely lift it up. This is another way of doing that once it's out of the furnace, but I don't like these. They're not very robust. Yes, they do allow you to hold the crucible, but it's kind of tough. Now over here, none of this is hot, by the way. I made a ring out of steel, welded it to a bar, and you can lift the crucible and pour nicely, and that felt a lot more robust to me for starting the furnace. A handy torch like this is good, but once it gets hot, you can shut it off, turn it on, shut it off, turn it on, and it's hot enough that the propane will just simply burn. This is graphite powder. In the bottom of the furnace, there is a small brick that the crucible sits on, and the crucible, when it gets hot, will stick to that brick. You need to put something in there as a release agent. Graphite powder works good for that. Or if you don't have any graphite powder, take a little square of cardboard and put it in the furnace and let it burn up underneath the crucible. It'll leave carbon products behind and the crucible won't stick. Lastly here, uh, borax. This helps clean the brass of impurities and gives you a better product. If you add some borax near the end of the melting process, stir the molten brass, and then spoon off the dross to get rid of the byproducts. When you are dealing with really hot stuff, a face mask is important. You want to wear a face mask when you're handling the molten brass and potentially when you're adding brass cartridges to the furnace. If you're dealing with rifle cartridges, like these are a bunch of 308 cartridges, it's really easy to see that they are unloaded. You want to be sure you are not putting any live rounds into the furnace, hot or cold, because when the furnace is hot, if say you're loading 22 rounds, you miss one that's a live one, happens all the time out at the range that people pick up brass and they get live rounds, that round will go off within a couple of seconds of getting into the crucible. You want to have protection from that. The best protection, don't put live brass in the crucible, but having a face shield on may save you from a big problem. Start off, well, let's get going here. Taking some of the graphite powder, and I just put a little on a brush, and then dab it on the bottom, or the brick in the bottom of the furnace. And we'll take some brass and put it in the crucible. Now this crucible will hold about 10 kg, 20 pounds, 22 pounds. So at this point we're going to grab the torch, and the propane tank itself is already on, so all we have to do is light the torch, reach down, turn the propane gas on, use the torch to light it up, get the second one, and at this point we've got a fire going. The tank needs to be adjusted to be approximately 5 to maybe 7.5 psi at the high point. Don't go much higher than that. Once the lid is on, I want to call your attention to the flame that comes out of the burner. It's barely visible, but it's notable that there's no white smoke. This means we have not reached the critical temperature where you're burning off zinc from the brass. It's important to note that this first heating of the furnace and the crucible and a load of brass is relatively slow. Don't turn the burner up to 10 or 15 psi. It won't help you. The process begins slow but steadily speeds up as you charge the furnace the second time, the third time, the fourth time, whatever, to get a full crucible of molten brass. Everything keeps going faster and faster and faster. Particularly, there's a step change in the speed that melting occurs at once you have a molten pool of brass in the bottom of the crucible. Be patient. Things will go faster. Here, the furnace is pretty darn hot. You can see it's still on at this moment. The crucible, of course, is glowing. The brass has compressed but hasn't actually melted into a pool. But it's time to compress the brass in the crucible to make room for adding more brass. I use a tube to pour the cartridges down into the crucible, as it's so easy to spill them all over inside the furnace, and this method is way better for your hands. While there is heat coming up through the tube, your propensity to get burned is pretty low. Anyway, you can look down the tube, decide how much to put in, and you'll see that I fill it more or less to a heaping state, but try not to overfill. Here I'm a little light, and so I add a few more, and that's it. Time to put the lid back on, refire the furnace, and melt those puppies down. I'm showing here that there is white smoke coming out of the furnace, and that means you've reached a critical temperature where zinc is burning off from the brass. I'm turning off the furnace at this point and reaching in with my spoon and lifting off dross that has gone to the top of the pool. We do have a molten pool of brass at this time. The dross does float, although there are impurities that go to the bottom, so use your spoon to scrape the bottom of the crucible also. And adding a little bit of borax at this point will help separate the dross from the good brass. So I'm just finishing up the dross removal, and it's time to recharge the furnace with another load of brass. And the thing you should notice at this point is I have an N95 mask on. The zinc fumes are not good for you at all. I found that in the early days I was pretty much ignoring the mask. Then I decided, no, the mask is actually pretty darn important and will save you trouble. You won't be smelling zinc fumes for the next couple hours after you get done with a melt. Here you can see me cleaning more dross off with light gloves on. However, the furnace is up to full temperature and the light gloves aren't enough, so I went back to the heavy gloves, and then things are just fine. It's time to prepare the molds for the pour. We want them to be dry and moderately hot so they don't chill the brass too fast when it's poured into it. I just take them and lay them up near the exhaust port of the furnace and heat them up to approximately 450 degrees Fahrenheit. And that takes place in only a couple minutes. Once they're hot, take them, lay them back on the refractory brick, and get ready for the pour. It's time to put on all of your good protective equipment. This is going to be probably the most dangerous part of the entire process. That's lifting the crucible out of the furnace and getting ready to pour. The pour itself is not so bad, but if something falls with the crucible, it's really bad. Okay, the furnace is off. One last cleaning of the dross to make sure we're not putting any impurities into our pour. We'll grab the tongs here in a moment and grip the crucible. Stand so that you don't have to take steps moving from the furnace to where you're going to change to your pouring tongs. You'll notice I have to wiggle the crucible a little bit. Even though it had graphite, it still stuck a little bit. And then you'll notice as I got almost to my ring, I thought it was going to drop, but it didn't. And now it's time to go over and lift the ring, which will encircle the crucible. And make the pour of 3 ingots. Don't overfill the ingots. They only need to go up near the top. It makes them easier to get out if there's a little gaposis between the top of the brass and the top of the sides of the ingot, or excuse me, the top of the sides of the mold. Because I'm going to melt some more brass, I'm going to pick up the crucible, put it back in the furnace, and go ahead and recharge it with fresh cartridges and keep going. Here you can see me removing the ingots from the molds. Normally, you can just flip the mold and the ingot will fall out. If it doesn't, let it cool a little bit more and try again. Sometimes you have to pick them up and sort of drop them, and the ingot will almost always break free. You can simply air cool your ingot, or you can slowly immerse the ingot in a bucket of water. Use the big pliers and just dip the ingot a little bit at a time until it stops hissing. Then swish in your bucket a few more times and you're done. Set it aside. When you're done taking the ingots out, they're all nice and cold and whatnot. There's going to be sometimes a crusty surface there. You can see the bottom is a lot smoother. When you want to, you can polish, grind, mill, bandsaw, do a lot of things to get rid of crusties, and eventually you can polish it. They take on a beautiful shine and they've got a most pleasing heft. Now, we've done some things that were a bit necessary to have caution. It can be dangerous, but it also can be very rewarding and fun. You need to be safe. Wear your personal protective equipment and follow safety procedures. You'll do well. That's it for this video. Have fun.